The massive ships of the Zelrani Empire moved through space like silent death. Commander Vexter stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the small blue planet grow larger on the screen. Earth looked peaceful from this distance, but he knew that would change soon. The Zelrani had conquered 437 worlds using the same method. Logic always won against emotion. Vexter had lived for over 800 years, and had never seen a species that could resist Zelrani superiority for long. Other races might fight at first, but they always surrendered when they realized the mathematical impossibility of victory. The Zelrani were simply better at everything. Their technology was more advanced, their strategies were perfect, and their minds were not clouded by useless feelings. Science. Director Kylene approached the commander with her datapad in hand. She had studied the humans for months and her report was ready. The beings on this planet were fascinating in their primitive way. They made decisions based on something they called emotions instead of pure logic. It was like watching children play with dangerous toys. The humans show all the standard signs of an emotional species, Kylene said in her calm voice. They form attachments to other individuals. They sacrifice resources for non-productive members of their society. And they continue fighting even when victory is impossible. Their decision-making process is severely compromised by chemical reactions in their brains. Vexter nodded as he reviewed the data. The humans had something they called families, where they wasted energy caring for offspring long after they could survive alone. They had institutions called hospitals where they used valuable resources to heal individuals who contributed nothing to society. Most strange of all, they created art and music that served no practical purpose. Have they responded to our transmission? Vexter asked. Yes, Commander. They have agreed to meet at the neutral station near their outer system. A human named Jake Morrison will represent their military forces, and another called Lisa Grant will speak for their government. Our analysis suggests they still believe negotiation is possible. The commander almost felt something that might have been amusement if Zelrani could feel such things. Every species tried to negotiate at first. They offered resources, territory, even complete surrender, in exchange for some form of independence. The Zelrani always accepted complete surrender, but independence was not logical. Inferior species needed guidance from their superiors. 3 days later, Vexter and his team arrived at the meeting station. The human ship was small and obviously outdated compared to Zelrani technology. When the humans boarded the station, Vexter observed them with clinical interest. They moved differently than Zelrani, with less efficiency and more wasted motion. Their faces showed constant changes in expression that served no apparent purpose. Captain Jake Morrison was a tall human with dark hair and lines around his eyes. That Kylene had explained came from something called stress. He wore a military uniform that was practical but included decorative elements that had no functional value. The female diplomat Lisa Grant was smaller with light brown hair, and she kept looking at her companions in a way that suggested emotional bonding. Welcome to the station, Lisa Grant said with what humans called a smile. We hope we can find a peaceful solution that benefits both our peoples. Kylene studied the humans as they spoke. Their vocal patterns changed based on their emotional state, and they used facial expressions and hand movements to communicate additional information. It was highly inefficient but strangely complex. She made notes on her datapad about their behavior patterns. Your species will submit to Zelrani authority, Vexter stated simply. This is not a negotiation. This is an opportunity for you to choose between peaceful integration and forceful conquest. Logic dictates that you will choose the path that results in the least loss of life. Jake Morrison stepped forward and his expression changed to what Kylene recognized as anger. We won't be slaves to anyone. Humanity values freedom above safety. We've fought wars against our own kind for the right to choose our own path. We won't give that up to aliens who think they know better. Your emotional attachment to this concept of freedom is exactly why your species requires guidance, Kylene observed. You would choose death over the logical solution of survival under superior leadership. This proves that emotions make you incapable of rational decision-making. Lisa Grant looked at her companion and then back at the Zelrani. You don't understand what makes us human. Yes, we feel emotions, but those feelings give us strength. Love makes us protect each other. Hope keeps us fighting when things look impossible, and compassion drives us to help those who can't help themselves. These aren't weaknesses, they're what make life worth living. Vexter processed this statement. With the same interest he might show for an unusual chemical reaction, the humans actually believed their emotional responses were beneficial. They had convinced themselves that their greatest weakness was somehow a strength. It would make their eventual surrender even more satisfying. "You have 72 hours to consider our offer," Vexter announced. "After that time, we will begin the integration process with or without your cooperation. Logic will prevail as it always does." As the humans prepared to leave, Kylene noticed something unexpected. Despite the obvious hopelessness of their situation, neither Jake Morrison nor Lisa Grant showed signs of despair. Instead, their emotional readings indicated something her equipment labeled as determination. They were actually planning to fight. The Zelrani returned to their ships to prepare for what would surely be a brief conflict. In all their conquests, no species had ever chosen destruction over logical surrender. The humans would learn the same lesson that 437 other worlds had learned. Emotion was weakness, and logic always won. The 72 hours passed without any message from Earth. Vexter had expected this outcome based on human emotional patterns, but it still seemed wasteful. The invasion fleet moved into position around the planet as Zelrani ground forces prepared for deployment. Every calculation showed the conflict would end within 6 standard days. The first battle began at dawn over the human city they called New York. Zelrani fighters swept down from orbit with precise formations and superior firepower. Their computers had calculated the exact number of strikes needed to disable human defenses without destroying valuable infrastructure. Everything proceeded according to plan until the humans started fighting back. Danny Rodriguez crouched behind the wreckage of a human aircraft and watched the enemy ships circle overhead. His squad had lost half their members in the first attack, but the remaining soldiers refused to retreat. Command had ordered them to hold the position for exactly 12 minutes to allow civilian evacuation. The mathematical odds of survival were close to zero. "We can't hold them off much longer," his teammate shouted over the sound of Zelrani weapons. The aliens used energy beams that cut through human armor like paper. Their technology was so advanced that human weapons barely scratched their ships. Danny checked his watch and saw they still had 7 minutes to go. Around him, other human soldiers continued firing even though their weapons had little effect. Some of them were crying as they fought, but none of them ran away. Logic said they should have surrendered by now, but something else kept them fighting. In the medical sector, Nurse Katie Bell ran through collapsing corridors as Zelrani bombs shook the building. She had been ordered to evacuate with the other medical staff, but there were still patients in the lower levels. Her supervisor had told her it was too dangerous, but she could not leave injured people behind. The elevator was not working, so Katie ran down 15 flights of stairs while the building shook around her. In the basement ward, she found 6 patients who were too injured to move on their own. 2 of them were human soldiers, but 4 were captured Zelrani who had been brought here for medical treatment. "I'm getting you all out of here," Katie said. As she started moving the first patient toward the stairs, the injured Zelrani looked at her with confusion in their large eyes. Their translators were working, but they could not understand why a human would risk her life for enemy wounded. One of the Zelrani prisoners tried to speak. "You should save your own kind first. Logic dictates that enemy casualties are acceptable losses." Katie paused in her work and looked at the alien. "We don't leave people behind. That's not who we are," she continued, moving patients one by one up the stairs as the building continued to shake. By the time she got the last patient to safety, the basement had collapsed. Engineer Pete Sullivan stood in the control room of the city's power station and watched the Zelrani advance on his position. His team had been working for 18 hours to modify the power grid into a weapon that could damage the alien ships. The plan would work, but someone needed to stay behind to activate it manually. "Pete, we need to go now," his assistant called from the doorway. "The evacuation is complete, and the aliens will be here in 3 minutes. Pete looked at the activation switch and then at his wedding ring. His wife and children were safe in the evacuation shelters, but they would not stay safe if the aliens took the power station. The weapon would only work once and would destroy the entire facility in the process. "Tell my family I love them," Pete said as he moved toward the switch. His assistant tried to argue, but Pete locked the control room door. Through the window, he could see Zelrani troops entering the building. He waited until they were directly below the power core and then activated the weapon. The explosion lit up half the city and took out 12 Zelrani ships. It also killed Pete Sullivan and damaged the aliens' confidence in their perfect calculations. For the first time in 800 years of conquest, Vexter watched his casualties mount beyond acceptable levels. Commander Vexter stood on his bridge and studied the tactical displays with growing frustration. The humans were not fighting like any enemy the Zelrani had faced before. Their resistance continued long past the point where any logical species would have surrendered. Worse, their unpredictable tactics were causing unexpected problems for Zelrani's strategy. Our ground forces report 30% higher casualties than projected, his tactical officer reported. The humans continue fighting even when surrounded and outnumbered. They are using suicide attacks and refusing to surrender even when defeat is certain. Kylene approached with her latest field reports from the surface. She had been studying captured humans to understand their behavior patterns, but her findings made no sense. The prisoners continue to resist interrogation even under extreme duress. They seem more concerned about protecting their comrades than preserving their own lives. The science director had interviewed dozens of human prisoners, including a Marine officer named Alex Turner and a civilian doctor called Helen Murphy. Both had refused to provide tactical information even when threatened with death. Dr. Murphy had actually asked to treat wounded Zelrani prisoners. Despite being tortured by Zelrani interrogators, their emotional responses are beyond our models. Kylene continued. They form bonds with individuals they have never met and will sacrifice themselves for abstract concepts like honor and duty. The Marine Turner told me he would rather die than betray his fellow soldiers. When I explained that his death would serve no logical purpose, he said some things were more important than logic. Vexter processed this information with growing confusion. In every previous conquest, captured enemies had eventually provided information in exchange for better treatment or reduced punishment. It was a simple matter of logical self-interest, but these humans seemed to operate under completely different principles. On the surface, the battle continued to rage beyond all Zelrani predictions. Human forces led by Captain Jake Morrison and coordinated by diplomat Lisa Grant had managed to turn the invasion into a prolonged conflict. They used emotional appeals to motivate their troops and made tactical decisions based on protecting civilians, rather than achieving military objectives. The humans had created something they called resistance cells that operated independently even when cut off from central command. These groups continued fighting not because they expected to win, but because they refused to give up hope. Their radio broadcasts spoke of freedom and sacrifice in ways that Zelrani computers could not quantify or predict. As the third day of fighting ended, Vexter realized that his perfect mathematical models had failed completely. The humans were supposed to have surrendered by now, but instead they seemed to be fighting harder. Their emotional responses were not making them weaker as logic dictated. Instead, those same emotions were somehow making them stronger. For the first time in his long life, Commander Vexter experienced something he could not identify or understand. His perfect certainty was cracking, and something unfamiliar was seeping in through the gaps. The siege of New Geneva had lasted 8 days when Zelrani soldier Zarvel first experienced something beyond his understanding. He crouched behind a barrier watching human mimetic Chris Bennett move between the wounded. The battle had been fierce, and bodies from both sides lay scattered across the plaza. What Zarvel could not comprehend was why the human kept treating Zelrani wounded along with his own kind. Chris Bennett had been working without rest for over 16 hours. His medical supplies were running low, and Zelrani snipers made every movement dangerous. Logic dictated that he should focus only on human casualties and leave enemy wounded to die. Instead, he crawled between positions, treating anyone who needed help, regardless of their species. Zarvel watched through his scope as Chris reached another wounded Zelrani soldier. The human's hands moved quickly as he applied bandages and injected medicine. His face showed exhaustion and stress, but he never hesitated to help an enemy who would try to kill him once healed. It made no sense according to any Zelrani understanding of warfare. Target the medic, came the order through Zarvel's communication device. He is extending enemy resistance by treating their wounded. Zarvel lined up his weapon and placed Chris Bennett in his crosshairs. The shot would be simple, and the human's death would serve logical military purposes. But something made him hesitate. The human was not a combatant in any traditional sense. He carried no weapons and threatened no one. His only crime was showing mercy to enemies who had not shown mercy to him. Before Zarvel could fire, a Zelrani artillery strike hit the plaza. The explosion threw Chris Bennett against a wall and left him bleeding on the ground. Several wounded soldiers from both sides called out for help, but the human medic was unconscious and could not respond. Something unprecedented happened inside Zarvel's mind. He felt an unfamiliar sensation as he watched the human who had saved so many Zelrani lives lying helpless in the rubble. Without conscious thought, he left his position and ran toward the plaza. Enemy fire tracked him, but he ignored the danger, reached Chris Bennett and found the human badly injured but still alive. The medic's eyes opened and focused on the Zelrani soldier kneeling beside him. Instead of fear or anger, Chris showed something Zarvel's translator identified as gratitude. "Thank you," Chris whispered through blood-stained lips. "The others need help. Please help them." Even dying, the human was thinking about wounded soldiers he had never met. Zarvel looked around the plaza and saw injured beings from both sides reaching toward them. His training told him to eliminate the enemy wounded and extract useful information from the dying human. Instead, he picked up Chris Bennett's medical kit and began treating the nearest casualties. For 3 hours, Zarvel worked alongside the dying human medic to save lives that logic said were not worth saving. When Chris Bennett finally died, he was holding the hand of a young Zelrani soldier whose life he had just saved. Zarvel felt something break inside his chest as he closed the human's eyes. The sensation spreading through Zarvel was not unique. Across the battlefield, other Zelrani soldiers were experiencing similar disruptions to their logical thought processes. Engineer Thailand had been ordered to destroy a human school but found herself unable to complete the mission after seeing children's artwork on the walls. The building contained no military value, and its destruction would serve only psychological warfare purposes. Thailand stood in the empty classroom looking at pictures drawn by human children. The images showed families and pets and imaginary creatures that served no practical purpose. One drawing depicted humans and aliens playing together under a bright sun. "Why do they create these things?" Thailand asked her demolition team. "The images serve no function and consume valuable time and resources." Her subordinate checked his equipment and prepared the charges. "Human offspring engage in non-productive activities until they reach maturity. It is evidence of their species' inefficiency." Thailand continued studying the children's artwork as her team worked. The pictures showed joy and wonder and hope for a future where different species might coexist peacefully. The young humans who created these images had never seen a Zelrani before the invasion, but they had imagined friendship instead of war. When the charges were ready, Thailand found herself unable to give the detonation order. Something about destroying these innocent expressions felt wrong in a way she could not quantify. Her logical mind told her the building had no value, but another part of her mind was developing different priorities. Navigator Plexion experienced his first emotional disruption while monitoring human communications. His job was to intercept military transmissions and identify strategic targets, but he kept hearing conversations that made no tactical sense. Humans used their communication networks to check on family members, share jokes, and offer comfort to strangers. During the siege, Plexion monitored a transmission between a human mother and her daughter who was trapped in the combat zone. The conversation contained no useful intelligence, but he found himself listening anyway. The mother's voice carried what his translator identified as love and concern, while the daughter tried to sound brave despite obvious fear. "I'm scared, Mum," the young human admitted, "but the soldiers here are protecting us and everyone is helping each other. Even people I don't know are sharing food and medicine." "I love you, sweetie," the mother replied. "Be strong and remember that no matter what happens, we'll always be a family." Plexion had monitored thousands of communications during previous conquests, but he had never paid attention to personal messages before. Military intelligence was all that mattered for successful occupation, but something about the human family bond made him continue listening to conversations that served no strategic purpose. The emotional contamination spread through Zelrani ranks like a virus affecting their perfect logical systems. Commander Vexter noticed a declining efficiency in his forces but could not identify the source. His soldiers were taking longer to complete missions and some were reporting equipment malfunctions that technical analysis could not verify. Science Director Kylene documented the phenomenon with growing concern. "Multiple units are showing decreased combat effectiveness," she reported. "Psychological evaluations reveal unusual thought patterns that do not match standard Zelrani cognitive profiles." "Define unusual," Vexter demanded. "Soldiers are expressing concern for enemy casualties, questioning orders that target civilian populations, and exhibiting what humans call guilt about their actions. Some have even requested transfers to non-combat positions." Vexter felt his own mind struggling with concepts that had never troubled him before. The human resistance was lasting far longer than any mathematical model predicted, and their casualties were mounting beyond acceptable levels. Worse, he found himself wondering if the conquest was worth the cost in Zelrani lives. Such thoughts were completely illogical, but he could not dismiss them. The humans had introduced something into the war that Zelrani science could not measure or counter. Their emotions were somehow spreading to his own forces and compromising the logical thinking that made the Zelrani Empire possible. On Earth's surface, human fighters like Captain Jake Morrison and diplomat Lisa Grant began to notice changes in their enemies. Some Zelrani soldiers hesitated before firing, others helped wounded humans reach safety, and a few had even surrendered rather than continue fighting. The war was changing both species in ways that neither side had anticipated. The Zelrani had come to impose their logical order on an emotional species, but instead they were learning what it meant to feel. Science Director Kylene approached the human refugee camp with her usual clinical detachment, but something felt different this time. Her research into human emotional responses had reached a critical phase, and she needed to observe their behavior under stress. The camp held over 3,000 human civilians who had been displaced by the fighting. What she found defied every logical expectation. Instead of the despair and chaos that should have resulted from military defeat, the humans had organized themselves into a functioning community. They shared limited resources equally, cared for their sick and elderly, and somehow maintained what they called hope despite their desperate situation. Kylene moved through the camp, taking notes on her datapad while human guards watched her nervously. The refugees had been told she was conducting a humanitarian assessment, but everyone knew the Zelrani did not understand the concept of humanitarian aid. Her presence meant more analysis and more attempts to quantify things that could not be measured. In the medical section, she observed human doctors treating patients with limited supplies and primitive equipment. They worked without pause, even though their efforts only delayed inevitable death. Dr. Helen Murphy, whom Kylene had interviewed during her captivity, recognized the science director and approached without fear. "Have you come to study us some more?" Helen asked, "or are you here to help?" "I am researching the psychological mechanisms that allow your species to maintain function under adverse conditions," Kylene replied. "Your behavior patterns continue to contradict established models of logical response to overwhelming force." Helen smiled in the way humans did when they found something amusing. "We're not responding logically because logic isn't everything. We keep going because we care about each other and because we believe things can get better." Kylene was about to respond with her standard analysis of emotional inefficiency when a small human child approached them. The girl was perhaps 6 years old with dark hair and bright eyes that showed no fear of the alien researcher. Most human children fled when they saw Zelrani, but this one walked directly up to Kylene. "Are you the scientist lady?" the child asked. "My mom said you're trying to understand people." Kylene looked down at the small human and felt something unexpected. The child's expression showed curiosity and openness despite everything her species had suffered. There was no hatred or anger, only innocent interest in meeting someone different. "I am conducting research," Kylene said carefully. "What is your designation?" "My name is Amy Carter," the girl replied. "What's yours?" No human had ever asked Kylene for her personal name before. During interrogations and interviews, they used her title or simply called her the alien, but this child wanted to know who she was as an individual rather than what she represented. "I am Science Director Kylene of the Zelrani Research Division," she responded automatically. Amy tilted her head and smiled. "That's a pretty name. Do you want to see the pictures I drew?" Before Kylene could respond, the child took her hand and began leading her toward a makeshift school area. The physical contact sent an unexpected sensation through Kylene's nervous system. Human touch was warmer than Zelrani contact, and something about the small hand in hers triggered responses she had never experienced. In the school section, Amy showed Kylene dozens of drawings that children had created during their time in the refugee camp. Despite their circumstances, the artwork showed bright colors and hopeful images. Many pictures depicted humans and aliens working together, playing games, or simply coexisting peacefully. "This one is my favorite," Amy said, pointing to a drawing of a human child and a Zelrani adult sitting under a tree. "It's you and me being friends." Kylene stared at the image and felt her logical worldview begin to crumble. The child had drawn her not as a conqueror or researcher, but as a friend. Amy had imagined a relationship based on mutual care rather than domination and submission. The concept was so alien to Zelrani thinking that Kylene's mind struggled to process it. "Why would you want to be friends with someone from the species that invaded your world?" Kylene asked. Amy looked up at her with those bright eyes and shrugged. "Because you seem lonely and everyone needs friends. My mum says that people do bad things sometimes, but that doesn't make them bad people." Something inside Kylene's chest seemed to expand and contract in an unfamiliar rhythm. Her breathing became irregular and moisture began forming in her eyes. The physical symptoms matched those she had observed in humans during emotional distress, but she felt no distress. Instead, she experienced something her translator could only identify as warmth. For the first time in her 1,000-year existence, Kylene understood what humans meant when they spoke of love, not the reproductive bonding that served biological functions, but something deeper and more powerful. A connection that transcended logic and self-interest to create genuine care for another being's welfare. "Amy," she whispered, "I think I would like to be your friend too." The child smiled and hugged Kylene's leg. The embrace sent waves of unprecedented sensation through the science director's body and mind. Everything she had learned about emotional inefficiency and logical superiority seemed meaningless compared to the simple joy of being accepted by an innocent soul. Meanwhile, across the combat zones, the emotional awakening accelerated through Zelrani forces. Commander Vexter found himself unable to sleep after ordering the bombardment of a human hospital. The building had contained wounded civilians, and the destruction served no strategic purpose beyond demonstrating Zelrani power. His tactical officer Mordix had questioned the order for the first time in his career. "Commander, the target contains only non-combatants. Their elimination will not affect enemy military capability. It will damage human morale and demonstrate the cost of continued resistance," Vexter had replied, but even as he spoke the words, they felt hollow. After the bombing, Mordix reported that human teacher Nancy Price had died in the attack. She had been reading stories to injured children when the building collapsed. Her final act was shielding a young patient with her own body. The child survived, but Nancy Price did not. Vexter found himself thinking about Nancy Price long after the tactical reports were filed. She had possessed no military value, and her death achieved no strategic objective. Yet something about her selfless final act created an ache in his chest that logic could not explain or dismiss. The commander was not alone in his struggle. Throughout the Zelrani fleet, soldiers and officers wrestled with new sensations and thoughts that challenged everything they believed about themselves and their mission. The emotional contamination was spreading faster than any biological virus and proving impossible to contain. On the Zelrani homeworld, the Council of Logic received disturbing reports about the Earth campaign. What should have been a simple conquest was turning into something unprecedented in their eighth. Their perfect soldiers were beginning to think and feel like the primitive species they were supposed to dominate. Emergency sessions were called to address the crisis, but the council members struggled to understand reports of Zelrani soldiers showing mercy, questioning orders, and even defecting to join human resistance groups. The concept of emotional infection seemed impossible according to all established science. Purifier Velshin received orders to travel to Earth with a special fleet designed to handle contaminated personnel. His mission was simple: eliminate the source of corruption and restore logical order to the invasion force. If that meant destroying both the humans and the infected Zelrani, the council considered it an acceptable cost. Back in the refugee camp, Kylene sat with Amy Carter and watched human families share their evening meal. For the first time in her existence, she understood why beings would choose emotional bonds over logical efficiency. The warmth she felt while holding Amy's hand was worth more than all the scientific knowledge she had accumulated over the centuries. The awakening had begun, and there would be no turning back for either species. The arrival of Purifier Velshin's fleet changed everything. His ships emerged from hyperspace with the cold precision that had once defined all Zelrani military operations. Unlike the invasion force that had been fighting humans for weeks, these vessels showed no signs of emotional contamination. Their crews had been selected for absolute loyalty to logical principles. Commander Vexter received the transmission on his bridge while struggling with feelings he still could not fully understand. The guilt over Nancy Price's death had grown stronger each day, and his ability to make tactical decisions had become compromised by something humans called conscience. "Commander Vexter, you will report to my flagship immediately." Velshin's voice carried the authority of the Council of Logic. "All personnel showing signs of emotional contamination will be transferred to my vessels for purification processing." Vexter looked around his bridge at officers who had served with him for decades. Tactical Officer Mordix avoided his eyes, while Navigator Plexion stared at his console with obvious distress. These were the finest soldiers in the Zelrani military, but they had been changed by their exposure to human emotions. "What does purification processing involve?" Vexter asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Complete neural restructuring to eliminate emotional responses and restore logical thinking," Velshin replied without hesitation. Contaminated personnel who resist treatment will be classified as enemy collaborators and dealt with accordingly. But ultimatum was clear: submit to having their newfound emotions surgically removed or be executed as traitors to their own species. Vexter felt something twist in his chest as he realized the choice before him. He could return to being the perfect logical machine he had been for 8 centuries, or he could embrace these new feelings that made existence meaningful. In the refugee camp, Science Director Kylene held Amy Carter close as Zelrani security forces surrounded their position. The purification fleet had sent teams to collect all contaminated personnel and their human contacts. Amy looked up at her alien friend with trust that made Kylene's heart ache. "Are the new aliens going to hurt you?" Amy asked quietly. Wanted to lie and reassured the child, but she had learned that humans valued honesty even when truth was painful. "They think the feelings I have for you are a sickness that needs to be cured. They want to take away my ability to care about anyone, but that would make you sad," Amy said with the simple wisdom that only children possessed. "Yes," Kylie whispered, "it would make me very sad." The security team leader approached with weapons ready. "Science Director Kylene, you will come with us for immediate processing. The human child will be transferred to a standard detention facility." Something fierce awakened in Kylene as she heard those words. The thought of Amy being taken to a cold prison where no one would care for her triggered responses that went beyond logic or reservation. She stood and placed herself between the security team and the child. "Amy Carter is under my protection," Kylene declared. "I will not allow her to be harmed." The team leader seemed confused by this response. "You are exhibiting severe contamination symptoms. Report for processing immediately or face classification as an enemy combatant." Around the camp, other emotionally awakened Zelrani faced similar choices. Soldier Zarval refused to abandon wounded humans under his care. Engineer Thylan sabotaged her own equipment rather than use it against civilian targets. Each decision brought them closer to open rebellion against their own command structure. The three-way conflict began when Captain Jake Morrison led a desperate rescue mission to extract Kylene and Amy from the detention facility. His team included both human fighters and Zelrani defectors who had chosen emotions over logic. The unlikely alliance moved through hostile territory while being hunted by both the original invasion force and the new purification fleet. Pilot Ray Collins flew a captured Zelrani fighter while his co-pilot was the former enemy soldier. Their shared experience of caring for wounded beings had created a bond that transcended species differences. Behind them, Communications Officer Beth Walker coordinated with defected Zelrani engineer Thylon to guide ground forces through the battle zone. The fighting was unlike anything either species had experienced before. Emotionally awakened Zelrani found themselves protecting human civilians, while logical Zelrani forces tried to complete their original mission. The Purification Fleet attacked both groups with equal determination, viewing any deviation from perfect logic as contamination that needed elimination. Vexter made his choice during the battle for New Geneva's Central District. When he saw Purification forces preparing to execute captured human medical personnel, something inside him snapped. He turned his weapons on his own people and opened fire on the ships that had come to save him from corruption. "All units, this is Commander Vexter," he broadcast on all frequencies. "I am ordering a complete withdrawal from combat operations against human civilian targets. Any officer who refuses this order can consider themselves relieved of duty." The response was immediate and chaotic. Some Zelrani units followed their commander's lead while others remained loyal to the Purification forces. The unified front that had once made the Zelrani Empire unstoppable was shattered by the simple introduction of emotional choice. Purifier Velshin watched the disintegration of military discipline with cold calculation. The contamination had spread further than initial reports suggested, and conventional purification methods would not be sufficient. He activated the ultimate solution that the Council of Logic had authorized as a last resort. "Attention all forces. In the Earth system," he announced. "Any personnel showing signs of emotional contamination have 15 minutes to surrender for processing. After that time, this system will be sterilized to prevent further spread of the infection." The threat was clear. Velshin would destroy both Earth and any Zelrani who had been changed by human emotions rather than allow the contamination to spread to other worlds. The choice was no longer between logic and emotion but between existence and annihilation. In the ruins of the detention facility, Kylene held Amy Carter as explosions lit up the sky around them. The rescue mission had succeeded, but the cost was mounting rapidly. Human and Zelrani fighters worked together to evacuate civilians while facing enemies from multiple factions. I'm scared, Amy whispered against Kylene's shoulder. I'm scared, too, Kylene admitted, but we're together and that makes us stronger. Captain Morrison approached with updates from the battle. We've got ships from 3 different forces shooting at each other and civilians caught in the middle. We need to find a way to end this before Velshin makes good on his threat. Kylene looked at the human officer who had risked everything to save her and Amy. Around them, beings from 2 different species were fighting and dying to protect the right to feel emotions. The war had become something neither side had anticipated. When it began, there might be a way, Kylene said slowly, but it would require Velshin to experience emotion himself. If we could make him understand what he's trying to destroy, he might hesitate long enough for us to find another solution. The plan was desperate and unlikely to succeed, but it was the only hope for both species. As the countdown to system sterilization continued, humans and emotionally awakened Zelrani prepared for a final confrontation that would determine the future of consciousness itself. The final confrontation took place aboard Purifier, Velshin's flagship, as the countdown to system sterilization reached its last minutes. Captain Jake Morrison led the desperate boarding party that included both human fighters and emotionally awakened Zelrani. Their mission was simple in concept but almost impossible in execution. Reach Velshin before he could activate the planet-killing weapon. Science Director Kylene carried Amy Carter through the ship's corridors while explosions echoed around them. The child had insisted on coming despite the danger, saying that sometimes grown-ups needed help from kids to understand important things. Her presence gave Kylene strength that no logical analysis could have provided. They fought their way through automated defenses and loyal crew members who still believed in the purity of logic. Commander Vexter and his reformed soldiers held the rear guard while human engineers like Beth Walker and Zelrani defector Thylan worked to disable the ship's weapon systems. We're running out of time, Morrison shouted over the sound of battle. Velshin has sealed himself in the command center and we can't break through. The Purifier had anticipated their assault and surrounded himself with the most loyal elements of his crew. His voice echoed through the ship's communication system as he announced the final countdown. 2 minutes until system sterilization. The contamination will be contained. Kylene looked at Amy and made a decision that went against every tactical principle she had ever learned. I'm going to try talking to him, she said. Sometimes the direct approach works better than force. She activated the ship's internal communication system and began speaking directly to Velshin. Purifier, I want you to meet someone who changed my entire understanding of existence. Her name is Amy Carter and she's 6 years old. Your emotional attachments are irrelevant, Velshin replied coldly. Proceed to the nearest attention cell for processing. Amy stepped forward and spoke into the communication device with the fearless honesty that only children possessed. Hello, Mr. Velshin. Kylene told me you're scared of feelings, but feelings aren't scary. They make everything better. For the first time in the conversation, Velshin paused before responding. I am not capable of fear, young human. Fear is an emotional response that indicates logical inadequacy. Everyone gets scared sometimes, Amy continued. I was scared when the fighting started, but Kylene held my hand and that made it better. Do you have anyone who holds your hand when you're scared? The question hung in the air for long seconds while the countdown continued. In the command center, Velshin stared at the communication console with something approaching confusion. The child's simple question had exposed a truth he had never considered. In his 800 years of existence, no one had ever offered him comfort or companionship. I do not require emotional support, he said, but his voice lacked its previous certainty. That sounds really lonely, Amy replied with genuine sympathy. Would you like to be friends? Friends help each other feel better. Kylene watched a countdown timer and realized they had less than 60 seconds remaining. Around them, the battle continued as loyal Zelrani forces tried to prevent the boarding party from reaching their commander. But something in Velshin's silence suggested that Amy's words were having an unexpected effect. Purifier, Kylene said urgently, you have the power to destroy 2 entire species right now. But before you do, I want you to consider what you'll be eliminating. Not just biological matter, but consciousness itself. The ability to feel wonder at a sunset, joy at a friend's laughter, or love for someone who needs protection. The command center doors suddenly opened and Velshin stepped out to face them directly. His expression showed the rigid control that defined all Zelrani leadership, but something in his eyes had changed. He looked at Amy Carter with an intensity that suggested internal struggle. You are the source of the contamination, he said. but without the hostility his words should have carried. Amy walked up to the towering alien without fear and held out her small hand. "I'm Amy, what's your name?" "I am Purifier Velshan of the Logic Council," he replied automatically, but he found himself staring at the offered hand. "That's a really long name," Amy said with a smile. "Can I call you Vel?" Friends should have short names so they're easier to remember. Something unprecedented happened in that moment. Velshan reached out and took the child's hand in his much larger one. The physical contact triggered the same emotional awakening that had transformed so many others. For the first time in his existence, he felt the warmth of connection with another being. The countdown reached 10 seconds, but Vel made no move toward the activation controls. Instead, he knelt down to Amy's level and experienced his first emotion. It was not fear or anger or joy, but something deeper. A sense of responsibility for the small life that had shown him kindness without expecting anything in return. "I don't want to hurt you," he whispered, as tears formed in his eyes. "I don't want you to hurt anyone," Amy replied, still holding his hand. "Can you stop the countdown?" Velshan looked at the weapon controls and then at the faces around him. Humans and Zelroni stood together watching him make the choice that would determine the fate of both species. With 5 seconds remaining, he deactivated the sterilization sequence. The silence that followed was broken by Amy's delighted laughter as she hugged the former purifier. "See, feelings aren't scary at all." The end of the immediate crisis marked the beginning of something entirely new in galactic history. The Zelroni Empire split between those who embraced emotional evolution and those who retreated to distant systems to maintain logical purity. Commander Vexter worked with human leaders like Captain Morrison and diplomat Lisa Grant to establish new forms of cooperation. The war crimes and atrocities committed during the invasion could not be forgotten, but they could be forgiven by beings who understood that growth required moving beyond past mistakes. Emotional awakening brought with it the capacity for mercy and the understanding that former enemies could become trusted allies. Kylene became the first Zelrani ambassador to Earth, while Amy Carter grew up in a galaxy where two species learned from each other's strengths. The child who had triggered a purifier's first emotion became a symbol of hope for peaceful coexistence between different forms of consciousness. Years later, other species encountered the Terran-Zelrani alliance and faced their own choices about the nature of existence. Some embraced emotional evolution while others resisted it, but the galaxy could never return to its previous state of cold logic. The laughter that had once mocked human emotions was replaced by tears of joy as the universe discovered that feeling was not weakness but the greatest strength of all. Love, hope, compassion, and even fear became tools for building bridges between species that had once seemed impossibly different. Amy Carter, now a young woman serving as an interspecies coordinator, stood with Kylene as they welcomed a new species to the Alliance. The former science director had become like a second mother to the human who had taught her how to feel. "Do you think they'll understand?" Amy asked as they watched the alien delegates struggle with concepts of emotional bonding. Kylene smiled and took her hand. "Just as she had done so many years ago in a refugee camp, they will learn, just as we did. Everyone deserves the chance to discover what it means to truly live." The galaxy was no longer ruled by the logic of conquest, but by the wisdom of the heart. And in that transformation, both humanity and the Zelrani had found something worth more than all the stars in the sky. They had found each other.